At the last family reunion, my father stood up and called me a failure in front of every relative. What he didn't know was that I had just walked away from a deal worth $91 million. By the time they realized whose empire they depended on, I had already cut them off, and the silence that followed was louder than any insult he ever threw at me. My name is Rachel Monroe, and I learned early that being the middle child in my family meant being invisible. Growing up in Columbus, Ohio, I existed in the shadow of two golden children who could do no wrong in my father's eyes. Daniel, my older brother, was everything Dad wanted in a son. Star of the debate team, president of student council, destined to inherit Monroe and Associates, the modest law firm Dad had built from scratch. Even when Daniel brought home a C in calculus, Dad would clap him on the back and say, "That's my boy, he knows how to prioritize what really matters." Then there was Claire, 5 years younger than me, with her dimpled smile and natural charm. She could spill grape juice on Dad's legal documents and he'd just laugh, calling her his little princess. Mom would flutter around, cleaning up the mess while Dad scooped Claire into his arms. And then there was me. I brought home straight A's from the time I could hold a pencil. I devoured science journals while other kids read comic books. By age 12, I was already fascinated by genetics and biotechnology, dreaming of a world where medicine could be personalized, accessible, affordable. But when I tried to share my excitement about DNA sequencing with Dad over dinner, his eyes would glaze over. "That's nice, sweetheart," he'd say, already turning his attention back to Daniel's latest achievement or Claire's adorable antics. The moment that crystallized everything happened when I was 14. I'd just received my report card all A's except for an A- in English. I was disappointed in myself, but I thought Dad might at least acknowledge my effort. I found him in his study, surrounded by case files, and nervously slid the report card across his mahogany desk. He glanced at it briefly, his eyes stopping on that single minus sign. An A- in English. You know colleges look at every grade. Rachel, you can't afford to be sloppy. My stomach dropped. No congratulations for the perfect scores in advanced biology, chemistry, or physics. Just criticism for the one imperfect grade. The same night, Daniel came home with his report card mostly B's with a few A's scattered in. Dad practically threw a parade. "Look at this well-rounded young man. You're going to make an excellent lawyer. Son, balance is everything." I stood in the doorway of Dad's study, watching him beam with pride over Daniel's mediocre grades, while my near-perfect performance had earned me nothing but disappointment. That's when I understood my place in the Monroe family hierarchy. I was the spare child, the one who could never quite measure up no matter how hard I tried. Mom, Linda, was a different kind of disappointment. She saw the way Dad treated me, the way my achievements were minimized while my siblings were celebrated for breathing, but she never said anything. She was a peacekeeper, a woman who'd learned to navigate around her husband's moods rather than confront them. Her love came in quiet moments, a gentle squeeze of my shoulder when Dad wasn't looking, an extra helping of my favorite dessert, whispered encouragements to "follow your heart, honey." But whispers weren't enough to shield me from the constant message that I would never be enough. The family dynamics played out the same way every holiday, every dinner, every gathering. Daniel's college plans were discussed with reverence. Harvard Law was the goal. Naturally, Claire's little achievements were celebrated with disproportionate enthusiasm, and my passion for biotechnology was treated like a peculiar hobby that I'd eventually outgrow. "Science is fine for a hobby," Dad would say whenever I brought up my future plans, "but you need to think practically. Law, medicine, business, those are real careers. This genetic stuff you're always reading about, it's just fantasy." Fantasy. That's what he called my dreams of revolutionizing healthcare, of making life-saving treatments accessible to everyone instead of just the wealthy. To him, my vision of the future was nothing more than a child's make-believe. By the time I was 16, I'd stopped trying to impress him. I focused on my studies, knowing that my only path to respect was through undeniable success. I applied for every science scholarship I could find, spent weekends in the local hospital's lab volunteering, and dreamed of the day when I could prove that the spare Monroe child had been the one worth watching all along. But even then, in my teenage determination, I couldn't have imagined how completely I would exceed every expectation they'd never had for me, or how satisfying it would feel to watch their world crumble when they finally realized who they'd been dismissing all these years. The acceptance letter from the University of Michigan arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Full scholarship to their biomedical engineering program, not just tuition covered, but room, board, and a research stipend. I held the letter in my trembling hands, reading it 3 times to make sure it was real. This was it, my ticket out, my chance to prove that all those hours spent in science labs and buried in genetics textbooks hadn't been wasted. I practically floated into Dad's study, the letter clutched against my chest like a lifeline. "Dad, I got in full ride to Michigan for biomedical engineering. They want me to work in their genetics lab starting freshman year." He looked up from his legal brief, took the letter, and scanned it with the same expression he might use to review a grocery list. After what felt like an eternity, he set it down and leaned back in his leather chair. "Biomedical engineering." He said it like it tasted bitter. "Rachel, this is exactly what I was afraid of. You're throwing away your future chasing pipe dreams." The excitement drained from my body like someone had pulled a plug. "Dad, it's Michigan. It's one of the best programs in the country." For what? Playing around in labs building gadgets that might never see the light of day. He stood up, moving to the window that overlooked our perfectly manicured suburban lawn. "Do you know what the unemployment rate is for people with engineering degrees? Do you know how few of them actually make it in the real world? But biotechnology is the future of medicine. The future of medicine is doctors and hospitals and pharmaceutical companies, real businesses with real profits." He turned back to face me, his expression stern. "I'm not saying you can't be involved in medicine. Pre-med at Ohio State, then medical school, or better yet, law school. Healthcare law is booming. You could work with medical companies, make real money, have real security." I felt like I was drowning. This was supposed to be my moment of triumph, proof that my dreams had value. Instead, he was systematically dismantling everything I'd worked toward. "I don't want to be a lawyer, Dad. I want to develop treatments that can help people who can't afford." "Can't afford?" His laugh was sharp, dismissive. "Rachel, you're 17 years old. You have no idea how the world works. You can't save everyone. You certainly can't build a career on saving people who can't pay you." That night, I found Mom in the kitchen, mechanically loading the dishwasher. She'd heard the entire conversation our house wasn't that big, and Dad's voice carried when he was making a point. "Honey," she said softly, not meeting my eyes, "maybe you should consider what your father is saying. He just wants what's best for you." "What about what I want? Mom, what about what I'm actually good at?" She finally looked up, and for a moment I saw something that might have been regret flash across her features. "Sometimes we have to be practical, sweetheart. Follow your heart. But maybe keep your options open." Follow your heart. But the story of my mother's support always qualified, always hedged, always careful not to directly contradict the man who controlled our household's emotional weather. The night before I left for college, Dad cornered me in the hallway outside my room. I'd spent the evening packing, trying to contain my excitement about finally escaping to a place where my interests would be valued, where professors would understand my passion for genetic engineering. "I'm going to say this once, Rachel, and I hope you'll remember it when reality hits." His voice was quiet but firm. "This biotechnology fantasy of yours, it's going to lead nowhere. You'll waste 4 years, maybe more, chasing something that doesn't exist, and when you come home with nothing to show for it, when you realize you've thrown away every practical opportunity I've tried to give you, don't expect me to clean up the mess." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You'll come back empty-handed, and you'll wish you'd listened to someone who actually knows how the world works." I stared at him. This man who was supposed to believe in me, who was supposed to want me to succeed. Instead, he was standing there predicting my failure like it was a foregone conclusion. "I won't fail," I said quietly. "We'll see." That night, lying in my childhood bed for the last time, I made a promise to myself. I would succeed. Not just succeed, I would build something so undeniably important, so transformative, that even Robert Monroe would have to acknowledge its value. I would prove that his dismissed, overlooked middle daughter had been the one with real vision all along. I had no idea then that this promise would consume the next 15 years of my life. I had no idea that I would sacrifice relationships, comfort, security, and countless nights of sleep to make it happen. I had no idea that success would taste as bitter as it was sweet, or that proving my father wrong would require cutting him out of my life entirely. But as I packed my dreams and determination into 2 suitcases and prepared to leave Columbus behind, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would never again let anyone make me feel small for dreaming big. The next morning, Mom cried when she hugged me goodbye. Dad shook my hand like I was a business acquaintance and told me to think seriously about transferring to a more practical major. I drove away without looking back, carrying his words with me like fuel for a fire that would burn for years to come. Fresh out of Michigan with my biomedical engineering degree and a head full of revolutionary ideas, I did exactly what my father predicted I'd never have the courage to do. I turned down 3 perfectly good job offers, stable positions at established medical device companies, complete with benefits, retirement plans, and the kind of security that would have made Robert Monroe proud. Instead, I took my $12,000 in savings, found the cheapest studio apartment in Ann Arbor I could stomach, and started Genexa Labs on my kitchen table. The idea was simple in concept, revolutionary in execution, rapid, affordable genetic testing for community hospitals and clinics. While the big players focused on expensive, complex diagnostics for major medical centers, I saw an enormous gap in the market. Smaller hospitals were drowning in wait times for genetic tests, sending samples to distant labs and waiting weeks for results that could determine whether a patient lived or died. I wanted to democratize genetic medicine, to put the power of DNA analysis into the hands of every doctor, not just those working in prestigious research hospitals. My first partner was Elena Cruz, a brilliant MBA I'd met during a biotech conference at the university, where I had the technical vision. She had the business acumen to actually make it happen. Elena understood markets, funding, regulatory pathways, all the unglamorous but essential pieces that would turn my kitchen table dream into a real company. You realize we're basically betting our entire futures on something that's never been done before, Elena said during one of our late-night strategy sessions, surrounded by takeout containers and prototype circuit boards. "Everything worthwhile has never been done before," I replied, soldering another connection on what would become our first functional testing device. That's what makes it worthwhile. The first 2 years nearly killed us. We worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week. I learned to live on 4 hours of sleep and survive on whatever food we could afford after paying for lab equipment and materials. My studio apartment became our unofficial headquarters, with genetic sequencing prototypes covering every available surface and Elena's business plans taped to my bathroom mirror. The rejections came fast and brutal. 8 different venture capital firms turned us down, often in meetings that lasted less than 20 minutes. "Community healthcare doesn't scale," they'd say. "The profit margins in small hospital markets are too thin. Genetic testing is already commoditized by the big players." One particularly memorable investor looked at our presentation and laughed. Actually laughed. "You want to make genetic testing affordable? That's not a business model. That's charity work. Come back when you've figured out how to make real money." I'd walk out of those meetings feeling like my father's voice was echoing in the conference rooms, unrealistic, impractical, destined to fail. By the end of year 2, We were 3 months behind on rent and surviving on ramen noodles in sheer stubbornness. I'd sold my car, my furniture, everything I owned except my laptop and lab equipment. Elena had maxed out her credit cards, keeping us afloat. We were one major setback away from complete collapse. That setback almost came in the form of our first major product failure. Our prototype genetic analyzer worked perfectly in controlled lab conditions, but crashed spectacularly during its first real-world test at a small hospital in Ypsilanti. The machine overheated, produced false readings, and nearly delayed critical treatment for a child with a rare genetic disorder. I spent 3 days straight rebuilding the thermal management system, running on coffee and desperation. Elena fielded angry phone calls from the hospital administrators while I tore apart our design and rebuilt it from scratch. Maybe they're right, I whispered to Elena at 3:30 on the third night, my hands shaking from exhaustion and caffeine. Maybe I'm just some naive kid who thinks she can change the world with gadgets. Elena looked up from her laptop, where she'd been frantically revising our business plan for the 100th time. You know what the difference is between naive dreamers and successful entrepreneurs. What? Successful entrepreneurs are naive dreamers who refuse to quit. The breakthrough came 6 months later. Our redesigned analyzer worked flawlessly during a pilot program at Mercy General, a small community hospital outside Detroit. Not only did it work, it exceeded every performance metric we'd promised. Faster results, lower costs, higher accuracy than anything the major diagnostic companies were offering to small hospitals. More importantly, it saved lives. Real, measurable, undeniable lives. A 7-year-old girl with suspected cystic fibrosis got her diagnosis and treatment started within hours instead of weeks. An elderly man's genetic predisposition to adverse drug reactions was identified before he received a medication that could have killed him. The local medical journal ran a story about the pilot program. Then the state healthcare newsletter picked it up. Within 3 months, we had inquiries from 47 hospitals across the Midwest. That's when the real work began. Scaling production, navigating FDA regulations, building a customer service infrastructure, hiring employees. Elena and I went from being kitchen table dreamers to running a real company with real responsibilities and real people depending on our success. But even as our first major contracts were signed and our bank account finally showed a positive balance, I thought about my father's prediction. You'll come back empty-handed. I wasn't ready to go back, wasn't ready to face him with partial success. I wanted to build something so undeniable, so transformative, that he'd have no choice but to acknowledge that his dismissed middle daughter had been right all along. I had no idea how completely that wish would eventually come true, or how hollow victory would taste when it finally arrived. 5 years after starting Genexa Labs in my studio apartment, we had processing centers in 12 states and partnerships with over 300 community hospitals. Our genetic testing platform had analyzed samples from more than 2 million patients, catching rare diseases that might have gone undiagnosed for months, identifying drug interactions that could have been fatal, giving families answers they'd been searching for their entire lives. The numbers were staggering even to me. Annual revenue had hit $47 million. We employed over 200 people across our facilities, major venture capital firms. The same ones who'd laughed us out of their offices years earlier were now calling Elena weekly, begging for meetings about potential investments. We're getting acquisition offers every month, Elena told me during one of our quarterly strategy sessions. Roche offered $60 million last week. Johnson & Johnson is circling at $75. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window of our actual corporate headquarters, a sleek building in Ann Arbor's tech corridor, complete with a real lab, real offices, and a conference room that could seat 20 people. So different from those desperate early days when we'd conducted board meetings around my kitchen table. What do you think I asked? Elena studied my face carefully. I think you're not ready to sell. And honestly, neither am I. We're just getting started. These community hospitals trust us now. We're building something that actually matters. She was right. every acquisition offer felt like a betrayal of our original mission. The big pharmaceutical companies weren't interested in affordable health care. They wanted our technology so they could integrate it into their existing high-margin systems. They'd probably triple our prices and cut off access to the smaller hospitals that needed us most. Let's keep building, I decided. We're changing how healthcare works in this country. I'm not ready to hand that over to someone else. But while my professional life was soaring beyond my wildest teenage dreams, my family relationships remained frozen in the same disappointing patterns. I still drove back to Columbus for major holidays, still sat at the same dining room table where I'd once been dismissed as a dreamer. And nothing had changed. During Christmas dinner that year, with Genexa Labs having just been featured on the cover of Modern Healthcare magazine as one of the year's most innovative companies, the conversation centered entirely around Daniel's latest case, a personal injury lawsuit that might net his firm $200,000. Tell them about the depositions, Daniel, Dad urged, his face glowing with pride. The way you cornered that expert witness was brilliant, pure legal strategy. I sat there quietly, cutting my turkey, while my father celebrated my brother's routine legal work. No one asked about my company. No one mentioned that I'd been invited to speak at the National Healthcare Innovation Summit. No one seemed to know or care that Forbes had included me on their 30 under 30 list for healthcare entrepreneurs. And Claire, Mom chimed in, turning to my younger sister. Tell everyone about your promotion at the marketing firm. Claire beamed as she described her new role as a junior account coordinator, managing social media campaigns for local restaurants. It was a fine job, perfectly respectable, and she deserved congratulations. But as the family celebrated her promotion to a $35,000 a year position, I couldn't help thinking about the irony. My company employed more people than all their businesses combined. We'd revolutionized genetic testing for millions of patients. I personally held 17 patents on medical diagnostic technology. But somehow, in this dining room, I was still the invisible middle child with unrealistic dreams. The pattern continued at every family gathering. Easter dinner, Daniel had made partner. Thanksgiving, Claire was dating a wonderful young man from a good family. Christmas, Daniel was considering running for city council. Wouldn't that be exciting? And Rachel, Dad would eventually say, almost as an afterthought. How's your little science project going? Little science project. After 5 years of building a multi-million-dollar company that was literally saving lives, he still couldn't bring himself to acknowledge what I'd accomplished. The breaking point came during a summer barbecue at my parents' house. I'd just returned from a conference in San Francisco where 3 different hospital systems had announced partnerships with Genexa Labs. Our stock price had hit an all-time high. Elena and I were featured on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine. But at the barbecue, conversation focused on Daniel's new BMW and Claire's engagement to her boyfriend, a perfectly nice accountant named Kevin. She's going to make such a beautiful bride, one of my aunts gushed, and Kevin has such a stable career, accounting now that's security you can count on. I excused myself to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. Mom followed me, probably sensing my frustration. Honey, you seem tense. Is everything okay? Well, when was the last time anyone in this family asked me about my work? Really asked. Not just, how's your little project going? Mom looked uncomfortable. Your father. He just doesn't understand what you do. It's not that he doesn't care. Doesn't he? Though, doesn't he care? I could hear the edge in my voice. I've built something important. Mom. Really important. And he still talks about it like it's a hobby I'll eventually outgrow. Maybe if you explained it differently? I shouldn't have to explain it differently. The results speak for themselves. But even as I said it, I realized the truth I'd never actually tried to make them understand. I'd accepted their dismissal, internalized it, and stopped trying to bridge the gap between their expectations and my reality. Part of me had given up on their approval years ago. I'd built my success in spite of them, not for them. And maybe that was exactly how I wanted it to stay. Standing in that kitchen, listening to my family celebrate conventional achievements while ignoring the unconventional empire I'd built. I made a decision. I would stop hoping for their recognition. I would stop expecting them to suddenly see my worth. I had no idea that within 2 years, circumstances would force them to see exactly what they'd been overlooking, and by then, it would be far too late for their approval to matter. The Monroe family reunion happened every 3 years, a tradition my grandmother had started decades ago to keep our sprawling extended family connected. This year, it was being held at the Marriott in downtown Columbus, with relatives flying in from across the country for a weekend of catching up, reminiscing, and the inevitable comparisons that came with any large family gathering. I almost didn't go. Elena and I were in the middle of crucial negotiations with a European pharmaceutical company interested in licensing our technology for international markets. We had board meetings scheduled, investor calls to manage, and a product launch to finalize. The timing couldn't have been worse. But Mom had called 3 times, practically begging me to attend. "It's important to your father that the whole family is there," she'd said. "You know how he values family traditions." So I cleared my schedule, drove the 3 hours from Ann Arbor to Columbus, and walked into the hotel ballroom wearing a simple black dress and carrying the weight of 7 years' worth of unacknowledged achievements. The reunion was exactly what I'd expected: cousins showing off their children, aunts and uncles discussing retirement plans, everyone catching up on jobs, marriages, divorces, and the general business of middle-class American life. I made polite conversation, complimented my young cousins on their school achievements, and listened to updates about various family members' careers in education, retail management, and small business ownership. No one asked about Genexa Labs, though I noticed a few curious glances when I mentioned I was still working in biotechnology. The family had long since written off my career as something incomprehensibly technical and probably not very important. The moment that would change everything came during dinner, when Dad stood up to make his traditional reunion toast. He'd done this at every gathering since Grandma died, positioning himself as the patriarch of our extended family, offering wisdom and celebrating the achievements of his children. "I want to take a moment to talk about what it means to be a Monroe," he began, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the practiced authority of a courtroom lawyer. "We're a family that values hard work, practical thinking, and real achievement." He raised his wine glass, and I felt that familiar knot forming in my stomach. I knew what was coming. "I'm proud to say that my son Daniel has truly embodied these values. He's made partner at Monroe and Associates. He's building a practice that will serve our community for generations, and he's carrying on the family tradition of legal excellence." Applause rippled across the room. Daniel smiled modestly, accepting congratulations from relatives seated nearby. "Daniel has made choices that reflect wisdom and maturity," Dad continued. "He's built something stable, something lasting, something that makes a real difference in people's lives." The knot in my stomach tightened. I could feel what was coming next, like a storm approaching on a clear day. Dad's eyes found mine across the room, and for a moment I hoped that maybe this time would be different. Maybe tonight he would finally acknowledge what I'd built, what I'd accomplished, what I'd proven. Instead, his expression hardened with disappointment, the same look I'd seen countless times throughout my childhood. "And then there's Rachel." His voice shifted, taking on a tone I recognized all too well, the voice he used when delivering bad news to clients. "I hate to say this in front of everyone, but I think it needs to be said. For years now, Rachel has been chasing unrealistic dreams, wasting her education on projects that go nowhere." The room went silent. I could feel every pair of eyes turning toward me. The weight of 60 relatives' attention suddenly focused on my humiliation. She had every opportunity to build a real career, to make something stable and meaningful of her life. Instead, she spent the better part of a decade playing around in laboratories, convincing herself that she's building something important. My hands were shaking. I gripped my wine glass so tightly I was surprised it didn't shatter. "The truth is," Dad continued, his voice gaining momentum like he was delivering a closing argument. Rachel is 34 years old and she has nothing to show for it. No husband, no children, no real career. She's a failure, and it breaks my heart to say it, but someone needs to tell her the truth. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, the clink of silverware as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Failure. The word hung in the air like smoke, seeping into every corner of the room, into every corner of my consciousness. After everything I'd built, everything I'd achieved, everything I'd proven, I was still in his eyes, in front of our entire family, nothing more than a failure. Aunt Margaret cleared her throat nervously. Cousin David stared at his plate. Someone laughed uncomfortably and then stopped abruptly. I stood up slowly, my legs surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Every face in the room was watching me, waiting to see how the family failure would respond to being publicly dressed down by the patriarch. "Excuse me," I said quietly, my voice barely audible above the awkward silence. "I need some air." I walked out of the ballroom with as much dignity as I could muster, past the relatives who couldn't meet my eyes, past the aunts who looked at me with a mixture of pity and embarrassment, past my mother who sat frozen in her chair like she'd been turned to stone. In the hotel lobby, I finally allowed myself to breathe. My hands were still shaking, but now they were shaking with something else entirely. Not shame, not embarrassment, not the crushing weight of paternal disappointment. Rage. Pure, crystalline, laser-focused rage. He'd called me a failure in front of 60 people. He'd dismissed 7 years of extraordinary achievement as playing around in laboratories. He'd humiliated me publicly, brutally, definitively. And he had no idea, none of them had any idea that in 3 weeks, the deal Elena and I had been negotiating would be announced. $91 million for Genexa Labs. A valuation that would make me wealthy beyond anything anyone in that ballroom could imagine. They had no idea that the failure they'd just witnessed publicly destroyed was about to become the most successful person in the entire Monroe family history. Standing in that hotel lobby, I made a decision that would change everything. This wasn't just about proving my father wrong anymore. This was about making sure he understood exactly what he'd lost when he chose to destroy me in front of our entire family. By the time they realized whose empire they'd been dismissing all these years, I would already be gone. 3 weeks after the reunion. I was sitting in Elena's office at 10:30 in the morning when the call came through. The final approval from Biogenesis International's board of directors, $91 million for a complete acquisition of Genexa Labs. "They're accepting all our terms," Elena said, hanging up the phone with a grin that could have powered our entire building. "Employee retention packages, continued focus on community health care, your position as Chief Innovation Officer, everything we asked for." I stared out the window at the Ann Arbor skyline, trying to process what had just happened. 7 years ago, I'd started this company with $12,000 and a dream that everyone called impossible. Now I was about to become wealthy enough to never worry about money again. But the strangest part was how empty the victory felt. I should have been ecstatic, calling everyone I knew, celebrating with champagne. Instead, I felt a cold, calculating satisfaction that surprised me. We need to keep this quiet until the official announcement," I told Elena. "No press releases, no leaks, nothing until Biogenesis is ready to go public with the acquisition." "Of course. Standard protocol." She paused, studying my expression. "Rachel, you don't look like someone who just became a multimillionaire. You look like someone planning a military campaign." She wasn't wrong. As we spent the next few days handling legal paperwork, employee communications, and transition planning, I found myself thinking less about the money and more about the timing. The official announcement was scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving us time to handle regulatory approvals and smooth the transition. 6 weeks to decide exactly how I wanted my family to learn the truth about their failure. It was during the due diligence process that I discovered something that made my blood run cold and then, surprisingly, made me smile. I was reviewing the client lists that Biogenesis wanted to analyze as part of their acquisition assessment when I saw it. Monroe and Associates, my father's law firm, listed among our corporate clients. They'd been using Genexa Labs' genetic testing services for 18 months to support a major medical malpractice case. I pulled up their account details, my heart racing as I read through the transaction history. They weren't just occasional users, they were heavily dependent on our services. The case they were building relied entirely on genetic evidence that only our platform could provide within their budget and timeline. The irony was breathtaking. While Dad had been dismissing my work as worthless fantasy, his own law firm had been betting their biggest case on the technology I'd developed. The playing around in laboratories he'd mocked was literally keeping his business afloat. I called our corporate accounts manager, Sarah Williams, into my office. "I need you to pull all documentation on the Monroe and Associates account," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Contracts, payment history, current projects, everything." "Is there a problem with their account?" "Not yet, but I want to understand exactly what services we're providing them and how critical those services are to their current operations." The report Sarah delivered the next day was even better than I'd hoped. Monroe and Associates wasn't just using our services, they were completely dependent on them. The genetic evidence from our testing was the cornerstone of their malpractice case against Mercy Hospital. Without our analysis, they had no case. Without our analysis, they would lose the biggest lawsuit in the firm's history. A lawsuit worth $2.3 million in potential damages. My father's law firm, his legacy, his precious, stable, and meaningful business was entirely dependent on the technology created by his failure daughter. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the client files spread across my desk. For the first time since the reunion, I felt something approaching joy. Not the pure happiness I'd expected from professional success, but something darker and more satisfying. Justice. The acquisition announcement was still 5 weeks away. The Monroe and Associates case was scheduled to go to trial in 4 months. That gave me a perfect window to time my revenge exactly the way I wanted it. I could pull their access to our services immediately and watch Dad's biggest case collapse. I could wait until the acquisition was announced and then reveal that his success had always depended on his daughter's work, or I could do something more surgical, more personal. I could give him the choice. Over the next few weeks, I maintained my normal routine, attending meetings, managing the transition, planning for my post-acquisition role with Biogenesis. But underneath the professional calm, I was orchestrating something much more personal. I researched every detail of Dad's malpractice case, understanding exactly how our genetic testing fitted into their legal strategy. I reviewed our service contracts, looking for any clauses that would give me leverage. I studied their payment history, their dependence patterns, their vulnerabilities. Most importantly, I kept my mouth shut. No family phone calls, no updates about my career, no hints about what was coming. Let them continue believing I was their disappointment, their cautionary tale, their example of wasted potential. The official announcement from Biogenesis came on a Tuesday morning in October. Biotech startup acquired for $91 million ran as the headline in both the Wall Street Journal and Forbes. My photo accompanied the article's Rachel Monroe, founder and CEO of Genexa Labs, described as a visionary entrepreneur who revolutionized genetic testing for community healthcare. I didn't call my family. I didn't send the articles to anyone. I simply waited. My phone started ringing at 11:15 a.m. First Elena, then employees, then board members, then journalists wanting interviews. I answered the professional calls and let the personal ones go to voicemail. Mom called 6 times. Daniel called twice. Even Claire called, probably prompted by our parents. I deleted all of their messages without listening to them. By the end of the week, the story had been picked up by local news outlets in Ohio, Columbus Native Cells Company for $91 million. There was no way my family could avoid seeing it now. But I still didn't call them back. Instead, I started planning the meeting that would end our relationship forever. The meeting where I would give my father exactly what he'd given me at the reunion, a public, humiliating revelation of just how wrong he'd been about everything. The meeting where I would show him that his success had always depended on the daughter he'd called a failure. And then I would take it all away. The restaurant I chose was Deliberate Morton's Steakhouse in downtown Columbus, the same place Dad took important clients when he wanted to impress them. I reserved the private dining room for 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, the kind of power lunch setting where he'd feel comfortable, confident, in control. I wanted him to feel in control right up until the moment I destroyed him. The invitation was simple and professional. Family meeting to discuss recent business developments. Please confirm attendance. I sent it to Dad, Daniel, and my Uncle Tom, who'd been at the reunion and had laughed the loudest when Dad called me a failure. 3 men who'd spent years dismissing me, who'd treated my achievements like childhood hobbies they'd grown tired of indulging. They all confirmed within 24 hours, probably curious about why the family disappointment was suddenly calling formal meetings at expensive restaurants. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the same black suit I'd worn for the Biogenesis acquisition announcement. Professional, understated, but expensive enough that anyone with experience would recognize quality when they saw it. I ordered a bottle of their best Cabernet and sat facing the door, watching their faces as they filed in. Dad entered first, looking around the private dining room with approval. He'd always been impressed by displays of success, and Morton's definitely qualified. "This is nice, Rachel. A little extravagant for a family dinner, but nice." Daniel followed, checking his phone as he took his seat. "I can't stay long. I have a client call at 8:30. Uncle Tom settled into his chair with a grunt. "So what's this all about? Your mother said you had some kind of business announcement." I waited until they'd ordered drinks and appetizers, letting them settle into their comfortable assumptions about this meeting. Dad was already holding court, telling Daniel about a case he'd won last month, explaining legal strategy with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own expertise. "Actually," I said, cutting through his monologue, "I wanted to talk about your current case, the Mercy Hospital malpractice lawsuit." Dad's expression shifted slightly, the first hint of surprise crossing his features. "How do you know about that case?" "Because your law firm has been using my company's services for the past 18 months to build your entire legal strategy." The silence that followed was sharp and immediate. Daniel stopped scrolling through his phone. Uncle Tom set down his drink. Dad stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. "I'm sorry, what?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the table between us. "Monroe and Associates has contracted with Genexa Labs for comprehensive genetic testing services. According to our records, you've spent $47,000 on genetic analysis that forms the foundation of your malpractice case against Mercy Hospital." Dad opened the folder, scanning the first page of contracts and invoices. His face went progressively paler as he recognized his own signature, his firm's letterhead, the case details he thought were confidential. "The genetic evidence proving medical negligence that came from my laboratories, the DNA analysis showing chromosomal damage, my technology, the expert testimony about genetic markers based on research protocols I developed." "This is impossible," Daniel said, leaning over to look at the documents. "You run some kind of startup thing. These are serious medical diagnostics." "No, Daniel. I ran the most innovative genetic testing company in the Midwest. Past tense. Because 3 weeks ago I sold it for $91 million. The number hit them like a physical blow. Uncle Tom actually choked on his drink. Daniel's mouth fell open. Dad went completely still, staring at the contracts like they were written in hieroglyphics. $91 million, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. For the company that you, Dad, publicly called a failure. For the technology that's been keeping your law firm profitable for over a year. Dad finally looked up from the papers, his face a mixture of shock and growing comprehension. "You're saying that our case depends on your company." Was dependent? Past tense again? I smiled, the expression feeling cold and perfect on my face. "Because as of tomorrow morning, Monroe and Associates will no longer have access to Genexa Lab's services." "What do you mean?" "I mean that your contract is being terminated, effective immediately. All pending analysis will be canceled. All access to our testing platforms will be revoked. All expert testimony agreements will be voided." The color drained from Dad's face entirely. "You can't do that. We have a contract. We have a case going to trial in 3 months." "I can do whatever I want. It's my company, or it was, until I sold it to people who understand its value." I reached for my wine, taking a slow sip while they processed what I was telling them. "The new owners have agreed to honor my recommendation about which clients deserve continued service." "Rachel, you can't be serious about this." Daniel's voice had gone sharp with panic. "This case is worth millions to the firm. If we lose access to the genetic evidence..." "You'll lose the case. Your clients will get nothing, and Monroe and Associates will probably face a malpractice lawsuit of its own for promising evidence you can't deliver." The beautiful thing was watching their faces as they finally understood Dad, the man who'd built his entire identity around being right, realizing that his success had depended on the daughter he'd publicly humiliated. Daniel, who'd spent years dismissing my work as irrelevant, recognizing that his father's law firm was about to collapse without my technology. "This is insane," Uncle Tom finally spoke up. "You're going to destroy your own family over some grudge." "I'm not destroying anything," I said calmly. "I'm simply withdrawing my support from people who spent years telling me I had nothing valuable to offer." Dad leaned forward, his lawyer instincts finally kicking in. "What do you want money as settlement? Name your price." "I don't want your money. Dad, I have more money than you'll ever see." I stood up, gathering my papers back into the briefcase. "What I wanted was for you to understand exactly what you lost when you decided to call me a failure in front of 60 people. Rachel, please, we can fix this. We can work something out." "No, we can't." I looked at each of them. These men who'd shaped my childhood with their dismissal, who'd made me feel small and worthless and naive. You had 34 years to treat me like family. You chose not to. Now you get to live with that choice. I walked toward the door, leaving them sitting at that expensive table with their expensive wine and their dying law firm. "Your case goes to trial in 12 weeks, I said without turning around. "I suggest you find alternative expert testimony. Good luck finding anyone who can match the quality of analysis you've been getting from my little science project." The last thing I heard as the door closed behind me was my father's voice, calling my name with a desperation I'd never heard before. It was the sweetest sound I'd ever experienced. I walked out of Morton's Steakhouse into the crisp October evening, my heels clicking against the sidewalk with a rhythm that felt like a victory march. Behind me, in that private dining room, 3 men were sitting in the wreckage of everything they thought they knew about success, failure, and family. My phone started buzzing before I reached my car. Dad calling, then Daniel, then Dad again. I let each call go to voicemail, knowing that for the first time in my life, they needed me more than I needed them. The drive back to Ann Arbor gave me 2 hours to think about what I'd just done, 2 hours to process the fact that I'd just cut myself off from my family forever, 2 hours to decide whether I felt guilty about destroying my father's law firm. What I felt was a kind of crystalline clarity I'd never experienced before. For 34 years, I'd been trying to earn respect from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I'd built an empire while they dismissed me as a dreamer. I'd revolutionized healthcare while they called me a failure. I'd become successful beyond their wildest imagination while they treated me like a cautionary tale. Now they knew the truth, and it was too late for any of it to matter. The news broke the next morning like a wildfire across Columbus business circles. Local biotech founder cuts ties with family law firm. The story was too delicious for local reporters to ignore the successful daughter who'd been publicly humiliated by her father, only to reveal that his business had been depending on her technology all along. By noon, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets. Family Feud threatens major malpractice case. By evening, it was trending on social media. Daughter's revenge when success becomes the ultimate payback. The calls from my family became increasingly desperate. Mom left tearful voicemails begging me to reconsider. Daniel sent emails explaining how many people would be hurt if Monroe and Associates collapsed. Dad, the man who'd once predicted I'd come home empty-handed, was now calling me 6 times a day. I deleted every message without listening to them. The most satisfying part came 3 days later, when the acquisition announcement hit the major business publications. Forbes ran a feature story, "From Family Disappointment to $91 million Success, the Rachel Monroe Story." The article included quotes from my reunion speech transcript someone had recorded Dad's public humiliation of me, and now it was part of the permanent record of my success story. Rachel Monroe's father called her a failure in front of their entire extended family just weeks before she closed a $91 million acquisition deal. The article read, "It's a stark reminder that sometimes the people closest to us are the least qualified to judge our potential." The photo they used showed me shaking hands with the Biogenesis CEO, both of us smiling in front of the Genexa Labs logo. I looked confident, successful, completely in control of my destiny. Everything my father said I'd never become. Within a week, Monroe and Associates had lost their malpractice case. Without the genetic evidence that my company had provided, they had no proof of medical negligence. Their clients received no settlement. The firm faced a lawsuit for failing to deliver promised evidence. Daniel called it professional suicide. The local legal community called it the most expensive family argument in Columbus history. I called it justice. 6 months later, I was settling into my new role as Chief Innovation Officer at Biogenesis International, overseeing genetic testing initiatives across 14 countries. My work was reaching more patients than ever before, making cutting-edge medical diagnostics accessible to communities around the world. Sometimes I thought about my family. I wondered if Dad had learned anything from losing everything because he couldn't recognize value when it was sitting at his dinner table for 34 years. I wondered if Daniel understood that success isn't always measured by the security of your paycheck. I wondered if Mom regretted all those years of staying silent when she could have stood up for me. But those thoughts came less frequently now, and they came without pain. I'd built a life that didn't require their approval, their understanding, or their presence. Standing on the balcony of my new penthouse apartment in downtown Detroit, looking out over the city lights and thinking about the patients whose lives would be saved by the technology I'd developed, I realized that revenge had given me something unexpected: freedom. Freedom from needing their validation. Freedom from caring about their opinion. Freedom from the exhausting work of trying to prove myself to people who were determined not to see my worth. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn love from people who confused love with control, respect with conformity, success with their narrow definition of achievement. Now I was free to define all of those things for myself. The silence that followed my revenge wasn't empty. It was peaceful. It was the sound of a life built on my own terms, measured by my own standards, celebrated by people who actually understood what I'd accomplished. It was the sound of victory, and it was louder than any insult my father had ever thrown at me. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? And what are your thoughts on family, success, and standing up for yourself? Please subscribe, share your own experiences in the comments, and let's connect with others who understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away.